Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brianna Coma, and I'm the Conservation Program Coordinator with Sierra Club Iowa chapter. I'm excited to discuss this ongoing and often overlooked issue, Iowa's critical loss of wildlife habitat and the need to restore wildlife habitat and the need to restore connectivity across our landscape. Iowa is one of the most biologically altered states in the nation. Since European settlement, we've lost over 99% of our native prairies, 98% of our wetlands, and more than 100 wildlife species. What remains is a patchwork of isolated parks, prairies, and woodlands that are too small and too far apart to support the biodiversity we once had. The Wildlife Connectivity Report was created to address this and to lay out scientific, legal, and community-driven cases for reconnecting Iowa's fragmented ecosystems. This is about more than wildlife. It's about water quality, climate resilience, and giving future generations the chance to experience a living, thriving Iowa. Today, we will hear from 4 speakers, and we will save questions from reporters until the end. Thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it over to Tom Rosenberg, a professor of biology at Drake University, where he teaches botany, ecology, biostatistics, natural history, and nature photography. He has over 40 years of field research and ecosystem management experience throughout Iowa and the upper Midwest. So I will hand it over to you, Tom.
All right, thank you, Brianna, and welcome everybody. Yeah, let's start with just reviewing what Brianna pointed out, the tremendous loss of native ecosystems in Iowa over the last 200 years. 99% of our prairie, 92% of our wetlands, 75% of our woodlands and forests. The actual figures vary a little bit on who does the calculation. That's looking at the total human footprint, modern human footprint on our landscapes. And that's, of course, a tremendous conversion from what once was a tremendously diverse and bountiful and productive landscape to, again, now a landscape where biodiversity is severely threatened. There's really 2 points to that loss, really. One is the actual quantity of habitat loss. 99% of our prairies gone. No more space, no more place for native species to be. They need to have room. No native ecosystem means no food, no cover, no species interactions that native species need. And this means, of course, that millions and millions of individual plants and animals that once were here are now simply gone. But the other important aspect is the quality of that habitat, too. We still have prairie that's left. Yes, 1% maybe at the best, maybe 5% of our wetlands, something like that. And so there is pieces and fragments of native ecosystem left, and it does provide habitat for native species. But the huge importance here, it's not the same quality as it was on the native landscape due to fragmentation. Because now those little bits and pieces are very, very small in their area and are separated by great distances, little islands in a sea of agricultural crops. This fragmentation issue is really a huge problem. It results in many things, but a really more important thing for today's topic is reduced gene flow, or the movement or spread of genes that naturally would occur through a species' populations. Now let's think about the importance of that biodiversity and those native systems, like tallgrass prairie. I think one can make 2 arguments. One, an ethical argument, kind of based on biocentrism and ecocentrism, that all living things and even ecosystems themselves possess inherent worth, independent of their utility to us. This viewpoint argues that native biodiversity deserves protection simply for existing. Its tremendous complexity, its interconnectedness, the fact that the native biodiversity is a product of billions of years of evolution, and the importance of that evolutionary process continuing is crucial for the continued adaptation and resilience of life on Earth. So just from that standpoint, we should be concerned about protecting biodiversity. There's also an anthropocentric viewpoint, of course, which is more self-centered from our viewpoint, that native biodiversity is helpful to us. And that's very true. Native biodiversity is crucial for healthy ecosystems, which provide essential resources, or we sometimes call those ecosystem services, for human welfare. Nature supports stable food supplies. Nature supports clean air and water. Nature supports a livable climate. Those are all things that make life better for us. Now, all human footprints have had a contribution to the loss of native ecosystems. Even the amount of roadways, the infrastructure of roads we have in Iowa, which is about 350,000 acres of roads, that's about the same amount of acreage that we have in state parks. We have over 600,000 acres of urban development. But that's really small, only about 3% total loss. The real culprit, of course, in terms of loss of native ecosystems is agriculture. It's responsible for the massive loss of our native landscapes. Ecosystems that once had thousands of species have been replaced with agriculture fields with now basically 2 species, depending upon which year it is. Heavy dependence on herbicides has eliminated many, if not all, weeds, which would increase the plant diversity. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides can reduce the populations of soil life. So agriculture has created a landscape that's extremely species poor, which is the opposite, total opposite of native systems. This loss of biodiversity is very crucial because, again, it's the biodiversity, it's the species themselves and their interactions that provides ecosystem services to us. Also ecosystem resilience and soil health. Fragmentation affects plants and pollinators importantly. So habitat loss and fragmentation have created this landscape again where now remnant plant populations are very small and widely separated. It's very hard for plants, which of course do not move around. They don't get up and walk around. It's very hard for plants then to find a mate, another plant to engage in reproduction. Mating, of course, for most plants occurs via pollination. So pollinators are key partners in plant reproduction. And fragmentation has made it harder for 1, plants to even attract pollinators, for 2, for pollinators to even find plants, and 3, for plants to even have access to individuals they are not related to. Because again, in these small fragmented populations of native plants, a lot of the relativity, again, in terms of who plants are related to, it's all one family, so to speak, again, because of that reduction in gene diversity. And that's a problem because the combined effects of reduced genetic diversity, again, no more gene flow, the effect of increased inbreeding, because again, plants that they have to mate with they are related to somehow, and also then decreased ability to adapt, all of those contribute to higher extinction rates. And for example, we know that about 86, 88 plant species have gone extinct in Iowa since 1800 or so. We have another 260 plant species. That's about 17% of our native plants that are endangered or threatened. The role of prairie and woodland corridors is important in, again, solving this problem and promoting gene flow. Gene flow in plants occurs mainly by 1, the movement of pollen, or 2, the movement of seeds. And whether that happens with the help of wind or animals, those are the 2 main ways pollen and seeds get moved around. Either way, the distance that plant genes can move is limited to generally less than a mile. Most seeds and pollen get deposited even closer to the plant source, lots of times within 100 meters or so. Again, whether it's being done through wind or insects or birds. So again, plants moving across the landscape, they only can move by little tiny steps, a few dozen meters at a time. And that's how they would have to get then from one remnant to another remnant in order to have gene flow. In order for that movement to happen, little steps by little steps, there needs to be a corridor of suitable habitat that connects those remnant prairies, wetlands, and forests to provide a route, to provide safe passage across this otherwise inhospitable landscape. So these corridors are crucial. Again, a corridor is a linear or corridor-like setting in which, again, we have habitat that's suitable for these species. In terms of restoration of those corridors for plants, there's really kind of two ready-to-use types of corridors, I think, that exist on our landscapes. One, of course, is our rivers and streams, which are very linear, of course, in their configuration, and they move across landscapes. And they already have, at least to some extent, many of them, some type of woodland or forest habitat on their floodplains. We could add to that by adding buffers of grasslands and prairies in addition to the woodlands and forests to increase the value of those. The other type of corridor that's sort of ready to use are our roadways. All of our roadways, of course. They have roadside ditches that usually have some type of grassland in them right now. It's often, again, non-native grasses like brome. But a lot of programs in Iowa, the Living Roadway Trust Fund has been promoting, of course, prairie on those roadsides, and a corridor of prairie along our roadways could help, again, at least for some species, especially plant species, in helping them, again, move across a landscape. The last thing I'll just say, and then I'm done here, is in Iowa, public land will never be sufficient for the conservation of native biodiversity. We don't have nearly enough public land. So it's critical that we develop public and private partnerships, conservation partnerships, in order to, again, achieve a better landscape that's suitable for biodiversity. And this can be envisioned as under the concept of working landscape. Working landscape is an area where people live and work in a way that allows native ecosystems to be sustained. A landscape where humans work as responsible members of a natural ecosystems. Business and social activities are done in a way that minimizes the disturbance to native plants and animals. All people within a working landscape balance their own needs. They make their own lives. They have an income. They have a life. They, again, need to have economic sustenance, but they do that within the needs of the environment, striking a delicate balance that is defined as sort of a mutualistic sustainability. Everyone, humans and our native flora and fauna, are both maintained in that type of working landscape. That's what we need to really work for more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. And now we will hand it over to David. David Hoffer is the professor of biology and environmental science at Briarcliff University in Sioux City. He teaches a variety of courses in conservation, climate change, biology, zoology, and environmental science.
All right. Thank you, Brianna, and thank you, Tom. I'm going to talk a little bit about the animals of Iowa and some of the effects of the greatly reduced area of habitat that animals in Iowa have. Wildlife, by statute in Iowa, is defined primarily as vertebrates, so species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Fortunately, the DNR and our Wildlife Action Plan have taken habitats into account and have also taken certain species of invertebrates into account. However, as Dr. Rosberg pointed out, with the greatly reduced amount of habitat that Iowa has, our animals are largely, arguably, not necessarily healthy in terms of their populations. Consider a lot of the small animals like our endangered rusty-patched bumblebee or small mice, that sort of thing, turtles. They can't necessarily travel very far in order to find another area of suitable habitat. Before, we reduced, prairies by 99%, wetlands by 95%, et cetera, in Iowa. It was one contiguous area of habitat, and they didn't have too much problem finding shelter, finding food along the way to find another area that would be suitable for nesting or denning, or creating a new hive if you're a bumblebee, that sort of thing. But today, bees might be able to forage for about 2 or 3 miles, and that's it. And if they're completely surrounded by an agricultural landscape, especially one where the previous hedgerows have been eliminated, they may not be able to find any other suitable landscape habitat in that landscape with the length that they can actually go to in order to find them. Turtles, small mammals, even small birds. There has been evidence that there are some small bird populations that once they nest in a fragment of prairie or a fragment of woodlands, they actually will not cross a road to another fragment. And so you have effectively, by fragmenting that habitat, isolated those populations. And then those populations are subject to potential inbreeding. They are subject potentially to something that's called an extinction debt. That there are problems with small populations, including inbreeding. There's also other problems that are called genetic drift, and some other problems as well that actually contribute to that small population becoming more and more unhealthy and unable to adapt to changing environmental conditions over the years. When we talk about vertebrates, this extinction debt can actually take decades. Extinction debt is the adults of the species might still be able to eke out a living and live a fairly normal lifespan, but they're just unable to leave behind enough offspring to replace them once they die. Thus, the population slowly declines over time. And so what you have is we might measure a population today and say it's healthy, but 5, 6, 7 decades from now, we can say, wow, this population is really in decline. And we've seen that in vertebrate populations around the world, where vertebrate populations have been documented as declining by an average of about 73%. Again, that's a population, that's not number of species. So if we have 330 people in America, well, let's say now we only have 90 million people in America. And there'd still be a country, but obviously it would be very, very different. And in many ways, we would consider it to not be as healthy. That's what's been happening to vertebrate populations around the world. We would like to reverse that trend here in Iowa. And there are some steps that Dr. Rosberg talked about that we could take in order to do this. Wildlife corridors are probably a very obvious way to help this happen. Species are naturally on the move. And if you think about birds or like any population of mammal that you might think of, you know that juveniles tend to disperse from their natal areas, especially of one sex. In young mammals, it tends to be young males, for instance. And what they'll do is they'll disperse from the natal area to prevent inbreeding. Well, if there are habitat corridors that they can disperse along, then they can find shelter, they can find food along the way before they find another core area, which could be another state preserve, in which they could live and establish their own home and actually breed and produce new members of the species. Without these corridors, it becomes much more difficult for these organisms to move around the environment. We even need to pay attention to some species such as our carnivores, because one of the problems we get with little fragments of habitat as well is that there are certain types of species that are lost that provide necessary ecosystem functions. Of course, plants are a critical part of this. Decomposers can be a critical part of this as well. But carnivores are also a critical part of this. We've seen bobcats move up into Iowa from Missouri, and we've seen black bears now potentially returning to northeast Iowa. It's possible for us to have robust agriculture and still live with some carnivores in the area. So one of the ways that we can do this, and Dr. Rosberg very helpfully talked about the corridors that could exist along our rivers, we could also think about putting in wildlife crossings, either overpasses over roads or underpasses under roads. These have been shown in many areas of the country to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by even over 80%. And of course, they provide a critical space so that species can actually cross what to them is basically a moving wall of vehicles safely and reconnect populations that are now disconnected because of the fragmentation of things like our roads. Another thing we can think about is more sustainable farming practices, bringing back hedgerows, regenerative farming, and there's even something called agroecology, where again, this is kind of like the working landscapes that Dr. Rosberg talked about, where wildlife populations can be healthy and human society can be very healthy as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. We will now hand it over to Wally Taylor. He is the Conservation Chair and Legal Chair of Iowa Chapter of Sierra Club, who has practiced environmental law for over 40 years and brings deep expertise on legal strategies to protect Iowa's ecosystems. Oh, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Tom and David have given you a great background as to what the problems are in Iowa and why we should care about it. I think many Iowans don't see the natural environment and habitat and wildlife as something to be all that concerned about. But it affects so much of what we do. And, people say they want to experience the outdoors, they want to hike, they want to see animals. We've seen a lot of interest in restoring monarch butterflies, for example. So I think we do care. We just need to know how to do it and how to go forward from here. Because much of Iowa's land that could provide habitat for wildlife is in private ownership. It's imperative that we encourage landowners to join us in preserving and expanding natural areas. To do this, landowners can create a conservation easements that designate certain areas as wildlife areas and natural areas. This means that as long as the easement is in place, the land cannot be used for any other purpose. There are many examples of this in Iowa, but we need many more. Years ago, the Loess Hills in western Iowa were investigated to perhaps be put in some sort of federal public ownership or possession, but they couldn't do it because so much of it was in private ownership. So that's why we need to look at easements. Other possibilities are USDA programs providing incentives to take land out of crop production or to maintain natural features. These programs are now under attack, so we need to ensure that they continue. The Farm Bill started in incorporating conservation practices back in 1985 and has done a pretty good job, but over the years, there has been so much pressure on farmers from big ag corporations to put more land back in production and grow more corn and soybeans at the expense, perhaps, of the land itself. And even now, Congress is delaying on enacting a new farm bill. So we need to let our legislators know that we want a farm bill that has good, strong conservation measures in it. Some states have adopted amendments to their state constitutions, establishing the rights of nature. Iowa should too. We have put in our report a possible amendment to the Iowa Constitution. This amendment would say that Iowans have a right to a clean and natural environment, and that the environment is the common property of all Iowans. The state and local governments are trustees for the benefit of all Iowans and future generations. and all laws and ordinances must be consistent with this amendment. So this would make Iowa laws and local ordinances protect Iowa's natural heritage whenever a law or an ordinance is adopted. Iowa could also adopt an Environmental Policy Act, patterned after the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, this would say that the state and local government entities must evaluate the environmental impacts of their actions and carry out the action with the least impact. You know, in my environmental law practice, I consistently have people saying, well, we need an environmental impact statement regarding this project that's going to impact the environment. And I have to tell them, well, the federal law only applies to federal projects. If there's no federal involvement, Iowa has no requirement that state or local entities do an environmental impact study and try to adopt the policy that would have the least impact. So a State Environmental Protection Act would solve that problem. There are also models for state laws that create wildlife corridors that both Tom and David talked about. California and Florida are good examples. Such a law would provide for a study to determine where the corridor should be and then create a wildlife corridor plan. The appendix to our report has a draft of a possible Iowa law that would create a wildlife corridor plan and promote these corridors and connectivity areas that both Tom and David talked about. And that's crucial to protecting our natural plants and animals that we have lost and are still trying to maintain in Iowa. One of the main problems in protecting wildlife and natural areas in Iowa is that the current economic system does not accommodate and sometimes is at odds with protecting our natural areas and our wildlife. As Tom said, agriculture takes up a vast majority of the land in Iowa, and many farmers are doing much better at not planting in areas that really don't have the best soil, but would be great for establishing a natural area for wildlife and natural plants. But the problem is that the big ag corporations are almost forcing farmers to do it the wrong way. But I think it's clear that farmers would do it the right way if there were incentives to do it the right way and disincentives for the big ag corporations to force bad farming practices on our farmers. Urban sprawl is another problem. Our urban areas in Iowa keep getting bigger, and rural Iowa keeps getting hollowed out. Small towns are vanishing. You can go through small towns in rural Iowa and you see buildings boarded up. You see very few people. And if we can restore those rural communities, I think that will provide incentives for people who live there to improve their environment around them. And that will promote more habitat, more wildlife. we mentioned highways. That's certainly one way to promote the natural areas along the highways. And also, we need these crossings that David talked about so that we don't find dead deer along the highway or dead raccoons in the middle of the highway. In fact, that the turtle that's on the cover of our report was one that Pam and I found on Highway 3, I think it was, in northern Iowa, right in the middle of the highway. So I took him by the tail and put him over on the right of way. But the wildlife crossings, you know, that turtle would have found a better way to get across that highway. So I think it's important that we look at ways that our economic system can still help us flourish, as our new Iowa motto says, and still leave room for the natural environment that we all cherish and really want to have in Iowa. So I think that's where Iowans need to put our effort right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we will now hand it over to Pam Mackey Taylor. She is the director and lobbyist for Sierra Club Iowa chapter and leads the organization of legislative and conservation efforts across the state.
Thank you. So we already have a framework that can assist us in funding some of these programs. But let's start out and say every year the legislature considers bills that would strip the Department of Natural Resources and its ability to acquire more public lands. Every year those bills are defeated. Long-term and ongoing, the Department of Natural Resources needs to be able to retain its ability to acquire and manage public lands, which provide wildlife habitat and form part of the linkages between natural areas, part of the corridor system. One of the programs that funds parks, recreation, wildlife habitat, soil conservation, water quality, and historical resources is REAP. That's REAP. REAP stands for Resource Enhancement and Protection. It is a state law that was enacted in 1989. Cities, counties, and soil conservation districts also benefit from REAP through a competitive grant process, which can be used to fund projects such as city and county parks. In fact, every county in Iowa has benefited from these funds. And the problem is it's statutorily recommended at $20 million annually, but the legislature has chosen to fund it at $12 million, significantly underfunding the projects that could be used for wildlife corridors and habitat enhancement. And REAP was extended to 2028 this year by the legislature, but that program needs to be extended beyond 2028 and needs to be given a secure future. And so if REAP were extended and extended at its fully funded amounts, we would have a significant amount of extra money to spend on wildlife corridors. Another program that's in place is the I Will program. In 2010, 63% of Iowa voters gave overwhelming support to a constitutional amendment that would increase investment in Iowa's parks, recreation, wildlife habitat, clean water, and soils. It's called I Will. It's also called the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. The 3/8 sales tax has never been funded in spite of large voter approval of the amendment. And it's now time to fund the sales tax, and that money could help us in habitat restoration and wildlife corridors. It is up to Iowans to let the legislators know that they want the state to invest in wildlife habitat and corridors and it's up to the legislature to implement these programs. But if we put a mind to it and an effort into it, we can improve the habitat, restore things that need to be restored, and make the corridors that'll help our plants and animals continue to survive in Iowa. And thank you. And now it's time for questions.
Yes, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll take you off mute. There is one question in the chat, and it was, what do you guys think is the first step to implementing wildlife corridors?
And one possibility is to ask the Department of Transportation to put that in their budget and plan for where to put the corridors and the crossings along the highways. And the DNR could also be involved in establishing corridors. So I think that the state agencies could be the first place to go. David, did you have some thoughts? Or Tom?
Yeah,
I'll
I
just-
was, oh, go ahead, Tom. Go ahead.
Well, I'll just quick say that, of course, if you're going to do that, there needs to be land. That's always the challenge in Iowa, right? If you're going to put habitat back on the land, you have to have control of the land. And so much of our land, of course, is privately owned. So that means that we have to find ways to get engaging private landowners, especially for those riverine corridors. Most of the private land goes right up to the river. And so if we're going to expand those corridors, add buffer strips, which should be done just for water quality protection, but would add another sort of ecosystem type of habitat in the way of prairie. See, a river corridor could have both woodland and prairie types of environments, which could benefit more species. We have to find ways, again, of coming up with probably programs, which means society has to support this. Taxpayers have to support this and be willing to put money into a program that helps private landowners do this. That's going to take some of their land out of production, for example. We've already got land, the sort of, the county or the state has access to land. It's actually owned by landowners, but roadway corridors, that I spoke about, those already exist. And so again, that has been a program that's been underway for many, many years. There are many, many miles of roadsides that have been at least put into at least some form of prairie. And no, those aren't very wide corridors, but nonetheless, they still provide, again, at least for plants, probably a safe way of moving across the landscape. We just need to have more counties adopt that, because not all counties utilize the Living Roadway Trust Fund program and actually have roadside managers that engage in this. I mean, a lot of counties don't put prairie back on the roadsides. They just haven't gotten into that. So yeah, I think the Department of Transportation is going to be a key partner in any of this, certainly with the roadways on the riverine and riparian areas, floodplain areas. Again, NRCS or again an agency that has contact with landowners, and of course, NRCS is the principal government agency that does that, and they operate at county levels as well as state levels too. So ultimately, I mean, I think it's again voters and it's people and it's society saying that this is important and the willingness to put money into it, because it's going to take money.
And I would just add just a couple things to that. One, there are states who have passed wildlife corridor laws, and basically the law is the legislature directs the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Transportation to actually study where the major crossings are for critical wildlife that are either of scientific value or of public value. and then recommend the crossings there. Oregon's done this, New Mexico's done this. There are a few other states who have done this successfully as well. In Iowa, we could also look at the slopes when we talk about potentially taking some land out of production. Well, there's some land where farmers either don't make much money or on average, they might actually lose money. These might be areas that were wetlands or floodplains that are very difficult to drain and, flood at least on average, once every 5 years. These could be steep slopes, say a slope of 9% or greater in gradient, where farmers are not very successful in terms of, producing crops or other farm commodities. And we could look at programs where then those could become, conservation easements, conservation reserve program, wetland reserve program, those types of things. And farmers could make some income on those lands when otherwise, it's kind of touch and go for them financially. The last thing that I would add there is we have a significant amount of grazing land in Iowa, and we shouldn't forget the importance of reintroducing native prairie grasses as part of grazing. Cattle can feed on a variety of different grasses, and many of them can be native. What has happened, of course, is we've brought over many of the grasses that cattle were fed over in Europe, and those have largely replaced our native prairie grasses. But we can bring back a prairie complex, and cattle can actually live quite well and quite healthily on that. And that can be part of these working landscapes where the prairies can not only support the cattle, they can now start to support more robust populations of Iowa's wildlife as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we do have one question from Anika from Inside Climate News. I'll have you unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, this is Annika Jane. Thanks all for being here. Oh gosh, no worries. I'm curious, you mentioned incentives for private landowners, and I know that there have been past incentives for landowners to adopt various conservation practices. Are there any that have been particularly successful that perhaps we can look to as models when thinking about wildlife corridors and how to kind of raise awareness among landowners?
Well, I would say again that NRCS has, many programs that, since they are in contact with farmers, they work with farmers, they have many programs. The Wetland Reserve, WCRPs, and a lot of those programs have been doing exactly what we're talking about. A lot of Wetland Reserve acres being put into floodplain situations because farmers, again, can't grow a crop reliably in an environment that floods once every 3 years or something like that. So yeah, it's being done. The NRCS, I think, is the agency to at least look for examples and models of how they've been doing this. They've also, I think, been important in implementing buffer strips in riparian areas as well. So between the NRCS and what they've been doing and the DOT with respect to roadways and roadside management and putting prairie back on roadways, those are two models that are showing success. I mean, you can actually go out in the landscape and you can point to places where what we're talking about is being done already. How effective it is a question, because ultimately those corridors actually have to connect larger populations of animals or plants. Ideally, again, a prairie remnant, a 40-acre prairie remnant in Jones County with another remnant in Cedar County or something like that. And so the continuity of those corridors is always going to be important, and the habitat quality. So again, I don't know that we can look and document or show that it's actually working, that genes are actually flowing like we want to see, but that's research that probably hasn't been done. But yeah, just to answer your question, I think there are good examples out there that are currently being practiced by NRCS and DOT in the sense that at least give us a good starting point.
And then, as I mentioned earlier, the 1985 Farm Bill started the Conservation Reserve Program, and subsequent farm bills added to that with other programs. Tom mentioned the Wetland Reserve, but in more recent years, the big ag corporations have incentivized farmers to put their land back in production, even though the Conservation Reserve Program and others were fairly successful. And I think if they had been allowed to go unimpeded, they would have been more successful. But the economic incentives from the big ag corporations have not been very helpful in continuing those conservation programs. And as I said, the current Farm Bill has not been rewritten, and there's no bill in sight that seems to be taking its place. And so the farmers are kind of left adrift, and we'd sure like to see a good, strong Farm Bill again with good, strong conservation measures.
Awesome. And we have a question from Rachel. Do you know how many counties participate in the Living Roadways program? What are the barriers to more counties participating, possibly staff or cost?
That's such information that could be looked up pretty easily on the Living Roadway Trust website. As I think about it, I think roughly maybe 60 to 70 out of the 99 counties have a Living Roadway Trust, a program going on in their county that helps to put prairies back along roadsides, something like that. Why counties don't adopt this, I don't know. Some counties just don't have a very strong, for whatever reason, a very strong sort of resource management program. They are more focused on cleaning the restrooms and mowing the grass at the parks. That's their main focus, as long as they think that's what they need to get done. Actually going out and managing invasive species and enhancing county parks, maybe they don't have the money and the staff. I don't know. Every county is different in that regard, of course. But that's a good place to start again by visiting with the Living Roadway Trust people and Iowa DOT to help engage more counties in that. It certainly does some good things by putting prairie back along roadsides. Again, at least provides a potential corridor for genes to flow. Now, some people would argue and point out that perhaps, that type of habitat might be detrimental. There's probably some research that might agree with that, because in a sense, what sometimes is happening is you're attracting animals into habitats now where they're trying to make a living along a roadway. And so animal vehicle accidents might be more likely to happen. And that is drawing an animal into a situation that's actually not very beneficial for it. So you have to, you want to think about that, of course, as well. But that's not a problem for plants, in a sense. So plant genes could easily move along those corridors if there was suitable habitat.
Awesome, thank you. And we have another question. Anita asked, are there concerns about funding cuts to the NRCS under the latest federal budget?
Well, I have to admit, I haven't read all 900 and some pages of the big ugly bill, but I don't think there were any real cuts to the Department of Agriculture or NRCS. I think that's probably waiting, as I said, for the Farm Bill, which from my understanding there's nothing in sight that indicates that's going to be taken up anytime soon.
Yes, any cuts to any federal organization that is there to protect natural resources. NRCS stands for Natural Resource Conservation Service. They're there to manage our soil resources and water resources. They're there to help landowners engage in practices that protect soil and water. They're there to engage farmers to help improve soil health. I mean, anytime that kind of assistance is being threatened by administration that says, "Oh, none of that's important. We don't need to fund that. You're going to reduce the number of staff because we don't need you." That's alarming. That's ridiculous. That's not the right direction to be going. Oh, if anything, we need more and more support for that kind of help and assistance in the landscape that we're living in, because it's not getting any better with the continued water quality threats and continued fertilization that's happening, of course, nitrogen rates that are being applied with the invasive species, influx of invasive species is virtually another war that has to be fought for the sake of biodiversity. Now, it's not just that habitats are lost due to agriculture. There's still prairies being plowed up. There's still wetlands being drained. It's not just that that's happening. The footprint of a habitat is completely lost, like I said. Now, even the ones that we have left are being completely threatened by invasive species. And so the ability for species to even live anywhere on the landscape is becoming a threat. And again, fighting invasive species is not necessarily the purview of NRCS, but they certainly are concerned about it. So everybody needs more funding. NRCS, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm alarmed that the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't have enough money to keep the refuges open. They don't have enough money to hire enough employees at Neil Smith. They have 3 employees trying to manage 6,000 acres. There is something wrong with our federal program and budgets if we can't put money enough sufficient funding into the Fish and Wildlife Service to support those fish and wildlife refuges and the people that work there. Yeah, it's a real thing. They're closing down. I take students to Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, try to every weekend on field trips, and I call them and tell them, "Can we come on Sunday?" And they say, "Nope, we're closed. Don't have enough staff." Had to reduce our hours because we don't have enough staff. That's your land. Fish and Wildlife Service, that's our public land. We should have a right to be able to visit that land and visit the visitor centers, of course, and all of that's going away.
All right, and we'll do one more question from Olivia. We have, how do you anticipate getting taxpayers to support these corridor projects when it comes to cost? Is there a typical price tag these projects tend to have?
I don't know about the price tag exactly, but that's what we're trying to do with this report, really, is to bring this to the attention of Iowans, explain why it's important, and explain that maybe we could spend less money on things that don't benefit all Iowans and spend it on items that do benefit all of us and benefit the environment around us. So I think it's a matter of priorities, a matter of political will, a matter of electing people who do care about the things that benefit all of us.
And I'd add that one of the things that we can point out is that for every dollar spent on conservation activities, we get a return of much more than $1 in terms of benefits to us. Much of this is in terms of the ecosystem services that we get, but we also get returns in terms of now wildlife recreation, hunting, fishing, the other types of things that we spend money on so that we can actually go out and experience nature. So in terms of, either putting an underpass or an overpass on the road, as far as I know, there isn't a typical cost for that because it varies by region, and of course it depends on how large the project is. But let's say that we want to put an overpass on a road and it's going to cost $4 million. Because you not only have to build the overpass, but in order to funnel, especially the large wildlife such as deer, onto that overpass rather than onto the highway, you also have to put fencing. And fencing for something, a movable species like a deer, it might have to go for even up to a mile both ways, and then on each side of the road to prevent them from going on that road. So how in the world can we justify, a very expensive project like that? Well, one of the ways to do that is to actually look then at the deer vehicle collisions that are actually prevented. Because your typical deer collision is going to cost, if I remember right, something around $15,000 for each collision. So that is an average across the United States, but that takes into account the amount of damage to a person's car because a deer is a large animal. It takes into account also then like an average of medical expenses for the people who were in those collisions. And when you start to reduce collisions by 70% or 80%, you are saving, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year very easily, even if it's a fairly, small road that isn't well traveled. If you put it over an interstate, you could be saving, much more than that each year. And so it's almost like saying, do you want to put solar panels on your house? Well, gee, I'm going to have to spend $15,000 right now. But then you look at, okay, how much do I save in terms of my electricity bills, and how many years does it take to pay it off? That's a way to do this. It's an upfront capital expenditure, but there's long-term gain afterwards. And so if that's a way of arguing it, that's a way of allowing people to understand that these projects pay for themselves in relatively short order. And the benefits in terms of having more wildlife and the recreation opportunities, the hunting opportunities, et cetera, extend for lifetimes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Those were incredible. I appreciate all the questions, but we're going to wrap it up here. If you do have any other questions, feel free to email us, and we'll kind of get back to you on that. But thank you again for joining the press conference today. We will have a recording of this that will be emailing out along with the report. If you think of any other questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out. And 3 of our speakers will be joining us for this Friday's Lunch and Learn. So tune in live on Sierra Club Iowa Chapter's Facebook for we'll dig a little deeper into the report, and you can ask more questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much again for joining. Bye, everybody.